So there's this new electricity bill policy that's just landed in Brazil from President Lula, or Lulu, as one of our sources calls him.
Right.
And straight away, you kind of have to ask, what's the real story here?
Exactly. It's being presented as a way to help, the poorest families by getting rid of their electricity bills.
But naturally, there are other layers, aren't there? Questions about the money side of things, the financial shifts, and, well, what some people are already calling the political angle.
Definitely. And for this deep dive, we've pulled together a few different things to help us get a handle on it.
Okay, what have we got?
Well, we've got some audio commentary, pretty direct stuff, capturing some strong initial feelings. Then we'll contrast that with some factual details from CNN Brazil news reports.
Good, good. Facts are useful.
And also a statement from a well-known intellectual, which adds a kind of broader ideological view.
Gotcha. So our mission for you today is to try and navigate through these different takes.
Yeah, figure out who this policy is really meant for, where the money, the costs might actually land.
And, what are the underlying ideas or viewpoints driving this whole conversation?
Precisely.
Okay, so let's jump right in with that initial commentary. It sounds like it sets a pretty strong tone from the start.
Oh, it certainly does. This commentator really doesn't mince words about their interpretation.
No kidding. We hear them say, and this is translated, of course, prepare your pocket, because Lulu will buy some votes with your money. You are the one who will pay.
Wow. Straight to the point.
Yeah, it's a very direct accusation, isn't it?
Yeah.
Framing this whole thing basically as a political deal.
It is interesting, the immediate jump to seeing a social policy purely through, an electoral strategy lens.
Right, and that's a perspective we'll probably see pop up again.
Seems likely.
Then, right after that, the commentator says something pretty dismissive about the people who stand to benefit. Yeah, kind of suggesting that, poverty isn't the real issue because there are jobs out there if people wanted them. It definitely colors their whole analysis.
That perspective, it shines a light on a particular view about, the causes of poverty and the function of social support, doesn't it?
Yeah, and that clearly shapes how they see the motivation behind this policy.
Absolutely.
Okay, then things get a little weird. The commentator shifts gears and starts talking about two activists, Tônia and Lula.
Yes, this part.
And the way they talk about them seems, like they're trying to be funny, almost mocking.
This bit really shows how this particular commentator deals with views they don't agree with. It seems like mockery is part of the toolkit to maybe undermine them.
Seems that way. There's some singing involved, apparently, and a reference to Tônia de Lula.
Which, for anyone listening who doesn't know, Tônia de Lula is a Brazilian TV character, kind of famously naive or out of touch.
Okay, so calling someone that is basically a put-down.
It implies they're maybe a bit eccentric or not really connected to reality, yeah. So it's setting a frame before we even hear them.
And then we get the actual clips. Tônia speaks first, identifies herself and Lula as coordinators from UABC University working in Favela de Moinho.
Right.
She says they're there supporting residents against the policies of Tarcísio de Freitas' government.
So a clear statement of who they are, where they're from, and their political position.
Yeah, but the commentator also makes a point of making fun of how Tonia's voice sounds.
Okay, so focusing on the person, not just the message.
Seems like it. Then Lewis speaks.
What does Lewis say?
Their language is much stronger. They talk about racist and hygienist police actions during demolitions.
Wow, okay. Hygienist implying cleansing or removing unwanted populations.
That seems to be the implication, yeah. And they call for people to stand against Tarcísio and what they call biased media coverage.
So using very powerful, critical terms to describe the situation they're protesting. A totally different viewpoint from the first commentator.
Completely. And all through these clips, the original commentator is jumping in with sarcastic comments, questioning if they're even legitimate. Basically just brushing off their concerns.
Yeah, it's a tactic, isn't it? Undermine the speaker, dismiss the message.
It really highlights how polarized the whole debate is around these issues. Different views aren't just disagreed with, they're, actively ridiculed by some.
That's a good way to put it.
Okay, so that's the initial take, very opinionated, very critical. Now, let's shift to the more factual side of things with the CNN Brazil report.
Right. This report seems to confirm the policy is actually happening.
It does. CNN Brazil confirms President Lula signed this provisional measure. It broadens the electricity bill exemption for low-income Brazilians.
It gives us some key details, the facts about the scope and the timing.
Yeah, and the scale sounds huge.
Yeah.
The report estimates over 80 million people could potentially qualify.
80 million. That's a massive number. Really shows the potential reach here. The report also mentions the timing. It's effective as soon as it's published, but consumers probably won't see it on their bills until around July.
Why the delay?
It takes about 45 days, apparently, for the electricity distributors to adjust their systems and billing cycles.
Okay, makes sense. Logistics.
Exactly.
And the CNN report also breaks down who exactly is eligible, right?
Yes, it gets quite specific. It includes families registered in Cadunico, that's Brazil's main registry for social programs, kind of the gateway for identifying vulnerable people. Specifically, those with a monthly income up to half the minimum wage per person.
Okay, so very low income.
Very low. It also covers people with disabilities or older adults who get the continuous cash benefit, the BPC.
Which is also for people with very limited means.
Correct. And also indigenous and Quilombola families who are in Cadunico, plus families living in really isolated off-grid areas.
So looking at that list, it really does seem targeted towards people facing, serious economic hardship.
The criteria definitely suggests the aim is to reach some of the most economically vulnerable groups in Brazil.
Okay, but what about the money? Who pays for this? What does CNN say about the cost?
Well, the government's estimate, according to the report, is about our $3.6 billion per year.
3.6 billion reais.
Yeah.
That's not insignificant.
No, it's a substantial amount, which naturally leads to the question of, well, how is it funded?
Exactly. Which brings us, I think, to that Volt robotics study that CNN also mentioned.
That's right. This study tried to project where that cost burden will actually fall.
And what did they find?
Their analysis suggests it's likely to be passed on mainly to the middle class and large consumers.
Large consumers like?
Like industries, big commercial businesses, that sort of thing.
Okay. And did they estimate how much bills might go up for them?
The report mentioned a potential increase of up to 12% for those large consumers.
12%. That's quite a hike. That could ripple through the economy, couldn't it?
It could. And actually, the CNN commentator in the clip we have touches on exactly that, this idea of a cascade effect. Meaning, when businesses face higher costs, like electricity, they often pass those costs along in the prices of their products or services.
Ah, right. So the bakery pays more for power. The price of bread might nudge up a bit.
Exactly. And those small increases across lots of different goods and services can add up, potentially affecting consumers at various income levels, not just the ones directly paying the higher energy tariff.
So wait, that first commentator's worry, the one who said, prepare your pocket, you will pay.
It seems to align, at least partly, with this economic projection from the Volt robotics study.
Interesting. Okay, so following this cost discussion, the commentary then pivots to something called the hate the middle class narrative.
Yeah, this is where it gets more ideological again.
The commentator asks, basically, why is the middle class supposedly always prejudiced against? And then they play that clip of Marilena Chaui.
Right. Marilena Chaui, she's a well-known philosopher in Brazil, generally seen as left-leaning. This clip, though, it's quite old, isn't it?
Yeah, the source said it's from 2013.
Okay, so over a decade ago.
And in it, she says something really strong. She says she hates the middle class.
Whoa.
Yeah, and she goes on to describe them using some very harsh terms like politically fascist, ethically violent, cognitively ignorant. It's a very pointed, very controversial statement.
It absolutely is. And it's important, like you said, to remember the context, one person's opinion from quite a while back.
But the initial commentator uses this specific old quote to bolster their argument, right?
Exactly. They seem to use it as evidence for this broader idea that there's some kind of animosity from the left towards the middle class in Brazil.
And they connect this back to Lula.
They try to, yeah. The commentator suggests maybe Lula and others on the left share this kind of sentiment. They even touch on voting patterns, suggesting that, maybe when people move up economically, become more middle class, perhaps they tend to shift their votes away from Lula's Workers' Party.
Ah, I see. So the argument is maybe this perceived dislike is linked to losing votes from that group.
That seems to be the commentator's interpretation, yes. Framing potential policy impacts on the middle class as maybe being driven by this underlying resentment or political calculation.
Well, quite a narrative they're building there.
It is. It offers one specific viewpoint on possible ideological factors at play, but voting behavior is incredibly complex. It's rarely down to just one single thing like class or perceived dislike.
True. Many factors involved.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's try and sum up that first commentator's overall stance based on everything we've heard from that source.
Okay.
They see Lula's electricity policy, first and foremost, as a way to buy votes from the poor.
Right, that was the opening shot.
And they believe it's being paid for by hitting the middle class and businesses with higher costs.
Which the Volt Robotics study partially supports in terms of where the costs might land.
And then they layer on top this idea that it's possibly fueled by a deeper ideological dislike for the middle class itself.
Using that specific dated quote from Marilena Chaui as their main piece of evidence for that part.
Got it. So yeah, it's a very critical, very political reading of the whole situation. It weaves the policy, the economics, and these accusations of political motive and ideology all together.
It certainly does. A highly charged interpretation.
Okay. So as we kind of wrap up this deep dive, it's really clear that the sources we looked at paint a pretty complex picture of this new policy.
Absolutely. You have the clear stated benefit for low-income families on one side.
Then you have the projected economic consequences for other groups, the middle class, businesses.
And layered over all of that, you have these strong political interpretations and social commentary, like we heard from that first commentator and the activists.
Yeah, it's really striking how something that seems like, on the surface, a straightforward social welfare policy
Can intersect with such complicated economic realities and really deeply held political beliefs.
leading to these incredibly varied and, frankly, quite intense reactions that we saw in our source material today.
It really does.
So as you, listening, think about all this, maybe consider the wider picture when policies like this are rolled out, policies designed to essentially redistribute economic burdens.
Yeah, questions like, who really gains in the long run? What are the unintended consequences, maybe, for different parts of society?
Do these kinds of measures actually work to reduce inequality effectively? Or do they sometimes end up creating, new problems, maybe new resentments between groups?
It's definitely a lot to chew on.
It certainly raises those big questions about finding the right balance, doesn't it? Between putting in place support for those who need it and fully understanding the broader economic and social ripple effects.
Yeah, there are always multiple angles, and the long-term outcomes, they can be really complex and hard to predict.
Well, thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We hope it gave you some useful perspectives.
Definitely encourage you to keep exploring these different viewpoints on this ongoing issue.
Until next time.